Rosei, welcome to today's Mishna Yomi. We find ourselves in Meseches Peah, Perek Dalid, Mishnah Ches through Tes. Fourth chapter of Meseches Peah, Mishnah 8 and 9. So Mishnah Ches says as follows, Ki Yotzebo. So continuing on the theme from yesterday's Mishnah, where we learned about the interesting idea about what happens if a person consecrates their grain. What's the impact, what's the implication of that for Peah as well as for other tithes and charitable obligations? So we saw that everything really depends on at what point in time a person is consecrating their grain. So along similar lines, the Mishnah says, Ki Yotzebo. Similarly, Hamaktish Peirosav Ad Shelo Ba'o La'onas HaMaisrus. So here's the interesting case. So we know that again, that Peiros, fruit, are also subject to Trumos and to Maisrus, to various tithes. Now the halacha is that produce generally only becomes subject to tithes when it's what we call Nigmar Malachton. Ultimately, again, they are finished. They're a ready product. They're ready product. So we saw, for example, grain is considered to be finished, ultimately, again, when it's piled. So obviously, every type of produce has its own stage at which point it's finished. But the point over here is as follows. A person went ahead and consecrated his produce before they became subject to any tithing obligation. So before the fruit was quote unquote complete, right? So, and again, we could just use the Bartanur just uses wheat as just a good example of this, right? Because wheat we've already been talking about. So for wheat, the finishing touch or the finishing process is the piling. So let's say you go ahead and you consecrate your wheat before it became subject to Trumas and Maisrus. So now again, it belongs to the Beis HaMikdash. Upedan, and then I redeem it from the Beis HaMikdash. Now, interestingly enough, in this case, the Beis HaMikdash didn't do anything to the produce. So the produce is pretty much in the same state when I redeem it as when I first consecrated it. So now after I redeem it, now I finish the produce, upedan, chayovin. Ultimately, again, now it becomes chayiv, ultimately in shumas and maisrus. Because remember, once again, the finishing step of the produce is done or is accomplished when it is owned by an individual, and therefore subject to shumas and maisrus. Remember, the underlying theme over here is that anything owned to the Beis HaMikdash, by the Beis HaMikdash, essentially is tax exempt. So no peah, leket, shichacha, no shumas and maisrus, mishabola onas ha-maisrus. However, halacha lamaisa, again, I went ahead and, let's say, so in this case, I had produce. The produce was finished. The grain was piled. I didn't do anything. I didn't separate any tithes, but I was makdish it. I consecrated it, and then I subsequently redeem it from the Beis HaMikdash. Chayovin. Ultimately, again, the produce will be subject to leket, shichacha, peah, as well as shumas and maisrus. Once again, because in this situation, it reached the finished stage while being owned by me, by an individual. Hikdishan achlo nigmeru. So here's the case. Let's say I go ahead and I makdish, I consecrate the produce before it was quote-unquote finished, right? Before it reached the final stage. And then what happens? Now I makdish it, belongs to the Beis HaMikdash, ugimar and hagizbar. And the gizbar, who's the temple treasurer, goes ahead and finishes the production of the fruit. In other words, he piles the grain. So the produce became finished while owned by the Beis HaMikdash, and then after the Beis HaMikdash conducted the finishing stages of the produce, I go ahead and redeem it. Peturin, ultimately, again, it is pater. Shivshas chavasan hayu peturin, because again, this is the same theme as the previous Mishnah, that essentially status regarding, now this is Trumas and Maisrus, but status regarding Truma and Maiser, different tithes, leket, shechacha, and peah, is all determined by what we call shas gimarasan. That halacha lamaisa, again, we're called nigmara malachtam, at the time when the fruit or the produce is considered to be finished. So at the final stage, when the fruit is finished, when the produce is finished, if it's owned by an individual, it will be subject to all of these various tithes and obligations. If, however, it is owned by the Beis HaMikdash at this time, then it is exempt. Beautiful. Mishna Tes. Ani. Very interesting case. Let's say a guy goes over to the Peah, goes over to the standing wheat in the corner of the field, and he acquires it on behalf of his friend, right? I go over to the field and I acquire it on behalf of my friend Ruvain, who is a pauper. Now, the Bartanura defines over here, and he explains what we're talking about over here is as follows. We'll call him, actually, let's make it easy. We'll call him Ruvain. Ruvain goes over to the standing grain in the corner of the field, what we know as Peah. Ruvain himself is a rich man. Baruch Hashem, he makes a good living. He goes over to the Peah, and he wants to acquire it on behalf of his friend Shimon. Shimon is a pauper. So Ruvain, again, a rich man, wants to acquire the Peah on behalf of Shimon the pauper. Does this work? Rabbi Eliezer Omer Zachalo, v'chachamim Omrim Yitner la'ani shnim tzavishon. So interestingly enough, Rabbi Eliezer says it works. It works. Ruvain can acquire the Peah on behalf of Shimon. The Chachamim say it does not work. It does not work because at the end, and therefore again, he must give away that Peah to the first pauper he encounters. The Bartanura explains something very interesting. What's happening here is as follows. Rabbi Eliezer says it works. Why? Because halacha l'maisa, technically speaking, a person could instantaneously impoverish themselves. How? If I take all of my possessions and I say all of my possessions are hefker, are ownerless, at this point in time, I technically own nothing anymore, and therefore, again, I am poor. Once I am poor, I am permitted to go out and take Peah. So Rabbi Eliezer says, since if Ruvain wanted to undergo instantaneous impoverishment and want to go ahead and be mafkir, make all of his possessions ownerless, he himself would be able to go ahead and acquire the Peah. Because he's now poor, once he's able to acquire the Peah on behalf of himself, he's able to acquire the Peah on behalf of Shimon as well. And the Chachamim say, no, we don't say that. We don't, without getting into all the technicalities, the Rabbanan say we don't make two migos, which is a halachic construct which we don't have to get into. But the Chachamim say essentially, we look at what you are right now. And since what you are right now is a rich man, you don't have the ability to acquire the Peah. And technically speaking, you can never acquire something on behalf of someone else that you yourself don't have the ability to acquire. So therefore, again, the Chachamim will say, since Ruvain right now is rich, and a rich man doesn't have a right, doesn't have an entitlement to Peah, therefore he can't acquire it on behalf of someone else who is poor as well. Incredible. So that's the fundamental machlokes. Haleket v'ashicha v'apesh ovei kochavim chai b'maisros. So this is another very interesting case. So the leket, shichacha, and Peah of an akum. So let's understand what we're talking about over here. We're talking about now a situation where a non-Jew separated out leket shichacha and Peah. Now remember, a non-Jew is not obligated in leket shichacha and Peah. So let's talk about for a Jew for just a moment. We saw this a couple of Mishnayos ago. When a Jew separates out leket shichacha and Peah. So remember again, leket means the stalk you drop, you don't go back and get it, you leave it for the poor. Shichacha, you're bundling your wheat, you left behind the bundle, leave it for the poor. And Peah, leaving a corner of your field. All of these charitable obligations, one is not obligated to separate out trumos and maisros from it, right? Because again, since essentially it's for the poor, you're not obligated to tithe that, and neither are the poor obligated to tithe it. However, if a non-Jew goes ahead and separates out leket shechacha and Peah, he decides to do this. Now, it's not real leket shechacha and Peah. Why not? Because halacha l'maisa, a non-Jew is not obligated in it. Therefore, again, when a Jew acquires this produce is not tax exempt, and therefore, again, you have to separate out meiser. Ela imkein hifkir. Now, unless of course, the non-Jew makes it hefker. If the non-Jew makes it ownerless, there's a general halacha that ownerless property is not subject to trumas and maisrus. So if the non-Jew, his kavan is to separate out leket shichacha and Peah, and a Jew then acquires this, so that is subject to the tithing obligations of trumas and maisrus. But if the non-Jew made it hefker, he made it ownerless, then it's like any other ownerless property, where halacha l'maisa, it is exempt from trumos and maisros. I'll just mention to you something interesting. With this, we'll conclude. The Rambam paskins in the first case in the Mishna, because this is quite interesting about a rich man being able to acquire the grain on behalf of a poor man. So the Rambam writes as follows. The Rambam says, "Hanichnas l'sadeu shel acher v'zacha ba'achas hamatonos l'chavera ha'ani imazocha ba'atzmo ha'ya'ani." So the Rambam writes as follows. The Rambam says, if Reuven goes into the field and he acquires Peah on behalf of Shimon, does it work? So the Rambam says it depends. If Reuven himself is poor, then he could acquire it on behalf of Shimon, who is poor. And the logic being, since Reuven as a poor man could acquire it for himself, since he could acquire it for himself, he could acquire it for the other as well. However, the Rambam writes, if Reuven was a rich man, avalim haya ashir, but halacha l'maisa, if Reuven was a rich man, since he could not acquire the Peah on for himself because he's rich, therefore he cannot acquire it on behalf of the poor person as well. So therefore, again, it turns out that the Rambam Paskins like the Chachamim in the Mishnah. Shkayach, everyone. We will stop here for today. Meretz Hashem. Tomorrow we will pick up with Mishnayos Yud and Yud Aleph. Wishing everyone a wonderful day.